Late summer, 1889, Nebraska territory. The kind of day where the sky looks too big and the wind tastes like dust. Garrett Thorne rode his fence line the way he did most evenings, slow, steady, alone. He liked the quiet. He trusted it. The prairie didn't ask questions. It didn't pry. It just stretched out forever and let a man keep his thoughts to himself. That's why the wagon caught his eye. It sat crooked in a shallow ditch beside the road. One wheel half-caved, the tongue angled like a broken arm. A thin ribbon of smoke drifted from a small cook fire that had nearly died, and beside it, kneeling in the dirt, was a woman with her sleeves rolled up and her hair pinned back in a tired, stubborn knot. She had both hands on the wheel like she could force it to be whole again through willpower alone. Garrett slowed his horse. He didn't live near town. Folks didn't pass his land unless they had business, and most people didn't have business out here. He kept his rifle on the saddle, not because he wanted trouble, but because trouble sometimes found a man anyway. The woman glanced up, and the look at her eyes made him pause. Not fear, not the fluttery kind, anyway. It was something sharper, like she'd already made up her mind about him before he'd even opened his mouth. Garrett tipped his hat, careful and polite. Evening. She didn't answer right away. Her gaze flicked to his hands, to the gun, to his horse, then back to his face. Dust clung to her cheek. Sweat darkened the collar of her blouse. She looked early 30s, maybe, but there was a hardness in her posture that made her seem older, like the world had leaned on her too long and she had learned to lean back. Garrett cleared his throat, trying to keep his voice calm, plain. "Why are you alone out here?" For a moment, the only sound was the wind teasing the grass and a far-off crow calling like it was laughing at them both. Then the woman's chin lifted. Not in pride exactly, more like defiance. Like she'd been asked that question before and had gotten tired of explaining herself to people who didn't deserve an answer. "I'm not alone," she said. Garrett frowned, eyes narrowing as he looked past her, over the wagon, over the ditch. He didn't see anyone. No horses tied nearby. No man. No other wagon. Just open prairie and the sinking sun. Before he could speak, something moved behind the wagon. A girl stepped out first. Tall for her age, thin as a rail, hair the color of wheat pulled into a braid that had come loose. 12, maybe. She held herself like a grown woman who'd been forced to practice being brave. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She simply placed her body between Garrett and the woman like it was the most natural thing in the world. Garrett blinked. Then a boy appeared, a step behind the girl. 10, maybe. His face was serious, his eyes guarded, his hands clenched tight at his sides, as if he'd decided long ago that being small didn't mean being helpless. Then 2 more, twin girls, 8 or so, clinging to each other like they were stitched together. One peeked around her sister's shoulder, eyes wide and bright with worry. The other stared straight at Garrett with a look that said she was memorizing him, cataloging him, deciding if he was safe. Garrett's horse shifted under him, sensing his surprise. He tightened the reins without thinking. Another child slipped out next, a little boy, 6, maybe younger, with hair too long and cheeks too hollow. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just stood close to the woman's skirt and looked up at Garrett with eyes that were too old for his face. Haunted, Garrett thought, though he didn't like the word. Like he'd seen something a child shouldn't. And then, last, came a small bundle in the older girl's arms. A baby, 18 months, maybe. Her face was smudged with dirt. Her cheeks were wet from crying. She made a soft whimpering sound, the kind that digs right under a man's ribs. 6 children. Garrett sat there on his horse, staring like he'd just watched the prairie itself grow a family out of the dirt. The woman stepped forward, not aggressive, but firm, like she was claiming the ground under her feet. "Now you can ask your question again," she said. Garrett swallowed. He didn't know what to do with the sight of him. He knew ranch work. He knew cattle and storms and loneliness. But a line of children standing behind a tired woman on a broken road, that was something else. That was a story with sharp edges. He lowered his voice. "Ma'am, I didn't mean they're mine, she cut in quickly, almost daring him to challenge it. All of them. The older girl tightened her hold on the baby. The serious boy shifted his weight as if he was ready to run or fight, whichever came first. The twins pressed closer together. Garrett took a breath. His eyes went to their feet. Barefoot, dirt-caked toes. One twin had a strip of cloth tied around her ankle like a bandage. His gaze moved to their clothes, patched, sun-faded, hanging loose on thin frames. The baby's dress was too small, the hem torn. The oldest girl's sleeves were too short, as if she'd grown faster than anyone could keep up with. He'd seen hardship. Everyone out here had. But this was the kind of hardship that didn't come from a bad harvest or a rough winter. This looked like running. This looked like hiding. The woman followed his gaze and stiffened, as if she could feel his thoughts. "We've had a long road," she said, jaw tight. "That's all you need to know." Garrett nodded once. He didn't push. Pushing got people hurt. He'd learned that in his own life. He swung down from his horse and approached slowly, hands open, showing he wasn't reaching for his gun. "Name's Garrett Thorne," he said. "My place is a mile north. I was riding the line and saw your wagon." The woman's eyes narrowed. Mary Sullivan. It came out like a challenge, like saying her name was an act of courage all by itself. Garrett stopped beside the broken wheel. He crouched, pressed his fingers against the wood, and felt the split. The axle was cracked through. Not a simple fix. Not something a lone woman and 6 children could patch with twine and hope. He stood again, dusting his hands on his jeans. "Axle's gone," he said gently. "Even if you get the wheel back on, it won't hold." Mary's mouth tightened. For a second, her eyes flashed with anger. Not at him, but at the world, at the unfairness of it. She glanced toward the road like she could see her plans scattered out there in the dirt. "We'll manage," she said. Garrett looked at the sky. The sun was dropping fast, staining the horizon orange and red. Out here, daytime heat could fool a person. Once the sun fell, the air turned sharp, and the sound he heard next made his shoulders tense. A low howl, far off but clear. Wolves. Mary heard it too. She straightened, and for the first time, the mask slipped. Just a hair. Just enough for Garrett to see what lived underneath that hard posture. Fear. Not for herself. For the children. The 10-year-old boy swayed. Garrett saw it before anyone else did. The boy, Thomas, he guessed, had been standing stiff like willpower could keep him upright. But his face was pale beneath the dust, and the way his eyes blinked slow told a different story. Mary reached toward him. Thomas took one step, and then his knees buckled. He went down like a stone, hitting the ground with a thud that made the baby cry louder. Mary dropped beside him, hands shaking as she touched his forehead. No, Thomas, look at me. Look at me." Her voice stayed sharp, but it cracked at the edges. Panic tried to crawl in, and she fought it like it was an enemy. The oldest girl, Emma, knelt too, still holding the baby. The twins hovered, eyes huge. The silent boy, Samuel, grabbed Mary's skirt with both hands as if he could anchor her. Garrett moved without thinking. He crouched beside Thomas, checked his breathing, felt the boy's skin, hot too hot. Heat exhaustion, dehydration. Out here, that could turn deadly quick. Mary glared up at Garrett, like his presence was the last thing she could handle. "Don't touch him." Garrett didn't flinch. "He needs water," he said, voice firm but not loud. "And he needs shade. He needs a bed. I can take care of my son," she snapped, even though the lie sat heavy between them. Garrett could see it in her eyes. She didn't have what he needed, not out here, not with that wagon and the wolves and the sun slipping away. Another howl rolled over the prairie, closer or maybe just clearer in the cooling air. Garrett rose, walked to his horse, and pulled his canteen free. He brought it back and offered it to Mary, not to Thomas, because he understood pride. He understood a person who didn't want to be helped. Mary stared at the canteen like it might be poison. Her fingers trembled just barely. Then she took it. She tipped a small amount into Thomas's mouth, whispering something low, something only a mother would say. Thomas swallowed weakly. Garrett looked at the children again, at Emma holding the baby like she'd done it 1,000 times, at the twins clutching each other, at Samuel's silent stare. They weren't crying much. That was the part that bothered him most. Kids cried when they were scared. These kids looked like they'd learned crying didn't change anything. Garrett made his decision. "You can't stay out here," he said. Mary's head snapped up. "We're not asking you for anything." "I know," Garrett answered. "But that doesn't change the facts." He nodded toward Thomas. "That boy will be worse by morning, and the night's coming fast." Mary stood, shoulders squared, like she could block the whole world with her spine. "We don't go with strangers." Garrett held her gaze. He didn't try to soften the truth. "Then you'll bury someone before the week's out." That landed. Mary's lips parted, and for a second she looked like she might slap him. Then she looked down at Thomas, and her anger melted into something raw. Garrett stepped closer, lowering his voice so the children wouldn't hear the edge of it. "My ranch is a mile north," he said. "There's water. There's shelter. I got a spare room and a stove. You can leave at dawn if you want, once the boy's steady." He paused, then added, "But you're not sleeping in that ditch." Mary's eyes flicked to the children, taking them in like she was counting, making sure they were all still there. 6. Always 6. The wind shifted. The prairie darkened by degrees. Garrett nodded toward his horse. "I'll carry the boy," he said. "You keep your children close." Mary's stare was hard, but there was a crack in it now. A thin line where hope tried to slip in, unwanted but necessary. Garrett waited, steady as a fence post. Finally, Mary swallowed. "If you try anything," she began. "I won't," Garrett said simply. She hesitated one last heartbeat, then gave a sharp nod as if she hated herself for it. "Fine," she said, "but we don't belong to you. We're just passing through." Garrett bent and lifted Thomas carefully, surprised by how light the boy felt in his arms. As he turned toward his horse, the older girl, Emma, met his eyes. Not pleading, not grateful, just watching him like she was the gatekeeper of this whole broken little world. Garrett met her look and said quietly, "I'll get him there." Emma didn't smile. She only tightened her hold on the baby and stepped in behind Mary as the family began to move. And as the last sliver of sun slid behind the horizon, Garrett Thorne led the way north, with a woman who trusted no one and 6 children who had learned how to disappear. Behind them, the broken wagon creaked in the wind like a warning. Ahead of them, a lonely ranch house waited in the dark. The ride to Garrett Thorne's ranch was quiet except for the creak of saddle leather and the shuffle of bare feet on the hard-packed dirt road. Garrett carried the unconscious boy, Thomas, across his horse's saddle, holding him steady with one arm while guiding the reins with the other. Behind him, Mary Sullivan trudged through the dust, her skirt torn at the hem, her shoulders rigid with exhaustion and distrust. The 5 other children followed close, huddled together in a silent, weary procession. The baby cried off and on, soft, pitiful sounds that made Garrett's chest tighten. He'd heard calves bawl in the night, lonely and scared, but this was different, smaller somehow, more human, more fragile. He stole glances back when he could. Emma, the eldest, kept a hand on the twins' shoulders, steering them forward. The little boy, Samuel, clutched at Mary's skirt like he was afraid she might vanish if he let go. Even in their silence, the family moved with a strange unity, each step guided by the others. They'd done this before, walked hard roads together. The sky had deepened to a bruised purple by the time Garrett's ranch came into view. A low 2-story house framed by a wide porch, a barn standing sentinel beside it, and a windmill creaking slow in the twilight. Smoke drifted thin from the chimney. Garrett had built the place with his own hands years ago, back when he'd thought a wife and a child would fill it with laughter. It had been quiet ever since. Now, with 6 children standing at the edge of his yard, it suddenly looked like a home again, though no one dared say it. Mary stopped short at the porch steps, clutching the baby tighter. The children hovered near her skirts, hesitant to enter a stranger's house. Garrett lifted Thomas from the saddle and carried him inside without waiting for permission. The main room smelled faintly of wood oil and old tobacco, with sunlight slanting through the window to catch dust motes in the air. He laid Thomas gently on a cot near the hearth and fetched water from the pump. Mary hovered by the door, ready to snatch her son back if Garrett made one wrong move. "He'll be fine," Garrett said quietly. "Just needs rest and water." When Thomas stirred a moment later, blinking in confusion, the air shifted. "Mama," he whispered hoarsely, "is this heaven?" Mary's lips trembled. She knelt beside him and stroked his hair. "No, darling, just a roof." Garrett turned away to give her privacy and busied himself with supper. He wasn't much of a cook, but he managed bread, smoked meat, and milk from the ice house. When he set the food out, the children stared at it like they'd forgotten what a full plate looked like. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then Emma nudged her brother. "Go on," she murmured. Thomas reached first, tentative, like he feared it might vanish. The others followed, twins whispering to each other, Samuel eating quietly, baby Grace gumming breadcrumbs. Garrett watched them without meaning to, and something twisted in his gut. Hunger like that didn't come from missing one meal. It came from months of scraping by. He poured milk for Mary last, but she waved it off. "Give it to them," she said. Her tone wasn't unkind, just matter of fact, like she'd said it 1,000 times. The way they ate told Garrett plenty. Emma cutting food for the twins, Thomas slipping half his portion to Samuel, Mary taking the smallest bite of all. It wasn't just survival, it was habit. And habits like that didn't come from laziness or pride. They came from being chased by bad luck, or worse. When the plates were nearly empty, a soft voice broke the hush. "Mister?" Samuel asked, not quite looking up. Garrett leaned back in his chair. "Yes, son." The boy's fingers twisted the edge of his napkin. "Are you going to hit Mama?" The question felt like a gunshot in the quiet room. Every fork froze midair. Mary's face went pale. The twins looked down. Emma's jaw clenched. Garrett's throat tightened, and for a second, he forgot how to breathe. "No," he said finally, steady but low. "No, son, I ain't gonna hit anybody." Samuel blinked, searching his face. "The last man did," he whispered. "That's why we left." Mary's eyes flashed with shame and fury. "That's enough, Samuel." She gathered the plates with shaking hands. Garrett didn't press. He just nodded once, more to himself than to her. Later, when the house quieted, Mary tried to put the children to bed. None of them wanted to be apart, so they made a nest of quilts on the floor near the hearth. 6 small bodies pressed together for warmth and comfort. Emma lay at one end with the baby curled into her side. The twins whispered until they drifted off, and Samuel tucked himself under Thomas's arm. Mary sat in a chair nearby, head drooping but eyes still open, keeping watch. Garrett stood in the doorway a while, hat in hand, watching the flicker of firelight across their faces. It hit him then how wrong his house had looked all these years. Too quiet, too empty. He stepped out onto the porch to breathe. A while later, the door creaked behind him. Mary came out, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. The air had cooled, and the stars were sharp and bright overhead. She didn't look at him right away. "You don't have to stay up," she murmured. "I can keep watch." Garrett shook his head. Ain't much to watch except coyotes and sky. Silence stretched between them, not exactly easy, but not hostile either. The kind of silence between two people too tired to pretend. "I'm not judging you," Garrett said after a while. Mary's shoulders stiffened. "Everyone does," she said softly. "A woman with 6 children, no husband. People think they know what that means." Garrett didn't answer. He just looked out over the dark fields where the wind whispered through the grass. Maybe folks should learn to mind their own business. Mary let out a faint, humorless laugh. If only. For a moment, her defenses faltered. "They're not all mine by blood," she said, almost to herself. "But they're mine all the same. I made promises. Garrett turned to her then, noticing for the first time the pale line around her finger where a ring used to be. A story hid there, but he didn't ask. He learned not to poke at wounds that hadn't healed. Instead, he changed the subject gently. "Your wagon's done for," he said. Axle split clean through. Mary looked down, jaw tight, as if the words themselves were a blow. "I can't afford a new one." Garrett nodded. Figured as much. He hesitated, weighing something. "You got plans?" "West," she said after a long pause. "We were heading west. Thought we'd find work near Denver." Her voice was thin, brittle around the edges. "Now I don't know." Garrett studied her face. The exhaustion, the stubbornness, the tiny flicker of hope she tried to smother. Finally, he said quietly, "I could use help here, if you're willing to work for wages." She blinked at him, clearly caught off guard. "Help? Cooking, cleaning, tending garden. House gets away from me sometimes." He gave a faint, awkward smile. "I can pay fair, not charity." She searched his face for the catch, the hidden cruelty. Finding none, she folded her arms. "Separate quarters," she said firmly. "The cabin by the barn. We'll sleep there." "Fine. And the children don't work." "I do." "Understood. Money's mine to save." "All right." She looked away, considering, then nodded once. "Then we have a deal." Garrett exhaled slow, relief mixed with something he didn't name. "Cabin's got a stove and a bed. Needs airing out, but it'll do." He glanced toward the door, where faint light spilled from inside. "You'll be safe here." Mary followed his gaze to where her children slept in their quilt pile, 6 small bodies breathing in unison. The hardness in her eyes softened just a little. "Safe," she repeated, as if testing the word for truth. Garrett watched her face, the way it shifted between steel and sorrow. He didn't say anything more. The stars burned bright over the prairie, the wind carrying the faintest echo of wolves too far off to matter. For the first time in a long time, Garrett Thorne wasn't alone on his land. And for the first time and longer still, Mary Sullivan let herself believe, just barely, that maybe she didn't have to keep running. Morning broke soft and golden over the prairie, the lights spilling across Garrett's land like a promise. The first thing he heard was laughter, thin, unsure, but real. It came from a cabin by the barn where Mary and the children had moved in. He smiled before he caught himself, surprised at the sound. Inside, Mary was already up, sleeves rolled, hair tied back, scrubbing a wash basin like her life depended on it. She'd taken his offer, though not without conditions. Her own quarters, her own rules, her own pride. Garrett respected that. Over the next week, the ranch began to change. The house smelled like bread again, and the porch, once coated in dust, started to look lived in. Mary cooked and cleaned the main house while the children helped where they could. Thomas worked beside Garrett in the fields, eager to prove himself. The boy had a sharp mind and hands that learned fast. Emma took charge of laundry, humming softly while she worked, her voice like something fragile coming back to life. The twins, Lily and Rose, spent mornings in the garden, picking vegetables and arguing in whispers. Samuel stayed near Mary's skirts, watchful, still haunted, while baby Grace tottered in the grass, finally beginning to smile. Garrett, for his part, did small things that went unnoticed, or maybe they didn't. He mended the twins' worn shoes one evening by lamplight. He made Thomas a wooden whistle and taught him how to mend a fence. He never forced talk, never asked questions that hurt. The children slowly began to relax, though Mary kept her guard up. One afternoon, as the twins helped dust the parlor, Lily accidentally knocked over a framed photograph that had been face down for years. It clattered to the floor, glass cracking down the middle. Emma bent to pick it up and froze. The photo showed a younger Garrett, standing beside a woman and a small boy, all smiling. The boy looked no older than 5. Later, Emma whispered to Mary that she'd found a small grave under the oak tree out back, 2 names carved into the stone. That night, Mary looked at Garrett differently, not with suspicion, but with quiet understanding. The next few days moved with the rhythm of ordinary life, and for a while, everyone forgot to be afraid. But then came the night baby Grace wouldn't stop crying. Hours passed, her wails slicing through the dark. Mary sat by the cradle, exhausted, eyes red, whispering soft words that didn't help. When Garrett knocked on the door, she looked up in defeat. "Let me try," he said. She hesitated, then handed him the baby. He walked her around the cabin, humming low, steady notes like a lullaby from another life. Grace quieted almost instantly, her head resting against his shoulder. Mary stared, something breaking loose inside her chest. "You had a child," she said softly. Garrett didn't meet her eyes. "A son. Fever took him. My wife followed soon after. She couldn't bear the empty house." The words came heavy, honest. Mary nodded, voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry." Garrett looked at her then. "You've known loss too." She nodded again, the silence between them thick with shared grief. "It doesn't go away," she said. "You just learn to carry it." "You're carrying more than your share," he said. She didn't argue. Outside, the wind brushed the grass, and somewhere in the dark, an owl called. Later, as the house settled into quiet, Thomas overheard their voices through the door and lay awake, understanding something for the first time, that this man knew what it was to lose everything and still keep standing. In the days that followed, the children began sharing their stories with Garrett, bit by bit, like pieces of a puzzle. Emma wasn't Mary's by birth. She'd been the neighbor's child, left alone when sickness took her parents. Mary had promised to raise her. Thomas had been left at a church doorstep. Mary's late husband had found him and claimed him as their own. The twins, Lily and Rose, had lost their parents to cholera. Mary had nursed them through fever and made a promise to their dying mother. And Samuel, Mary never spoke of his past, but the shadows in her eyes told Garrett enough. Every one of them, he realized, was a promise she'd kept, a piece of her heart given away. Garrett's respect for her deepened with every story. She was not a woman running from scandal. She was running from the cruelty of men who didn't understand mercy. Over time, laughter returned to the house. Garrett found himself teaching the children songs his son once loved, while Mary joined in shyly. They shared moments that felt natural, hands brushing while cooking, quiet glances across supper, long silences that didn't need words. Then one evening, while stars blinked above and the night air hummed with crickets, they sat together on the porch. "What if you didn't go west?" Garrett asked. Mary froze, looking out into the dark. "You don't know what you're saying." "I know what I see," he said simply. "This place could be your home if you let it." Before she could answer, the sound of hoofbeats broke the stillness. A lone rider approached fast, kicking up dust in the moonlight. Thomas, standing in the doorway, went white. His voice cracked with fear. "Mama, it's him." The rider came fast, dust kicking up behind his horse like smoke, and even before Garrett could see his face, he felt the air shift. The children had gone still, and Mary, who had faced storms, hunger, and nights without shelter, turned to stone. "No," she whispered, her voice hollow. "Not here." The man reined in hard at the fence line, a lean figure with a cruel smile and a star-shaped badge pinned crooked on his chest. His horse snorted and stamped as he tipped his hat. "Evening, Mrs. Crane." The name struck like a slap. The children flinched. Even the twins pressed closer together. Garrett stepped down from the porch, his hand resting lightly near his holster. "You're on private land," he said evenly. "State your business." The man grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "Name's Deputy Silas Crane. I'm here for what's mine." Mary's breath came sharp and shallow. "You're no deputy." Crane held out a folded paper. "Warrant says otherwise. This woman's wanted for kidnapping, theft, and corruption of minors. Took a boy that wasn't hers." His eyes slid to Samuel. "Ain't that right, son?" Samuel shrank behind Mary's skirt, trembling. Garrett's jaw tightened. "That boy doesn't look stolen to me." Crane's smirk deepened. "She stole him from me. I'm his lawful stepfather." The air between them turned to glass. Mary's face drained of color, and when she spoke, it was barely a whisper. "You killed his mother." Crane laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You talk too much, woman." Then his tone turned oily. "Hand the boy over, and maybe I'll forget the rest." Garrett's eyes narrowed. "You've got 5 seconds to turn that horse around." Crane leaned forward in the saddle. "You don't want trouble, rancher. You got no idea who you're protecting." "I've got a pretty good idea," Garrett said, voice low and dangerous. Mary's past came spilling out then, not by choice but by necessity. After her husband's death, she'd remarried in desperation, a mistake she'd paid for in bruises and fear. Silas Crane had been charming until the vows were said, then cruel when no one watched. He'd had a mistress, a young woman from town, Samuel's real mother. One night, drunk and jealous, he'd killed her. Mary had testified against him, and for that, he swore revenge. The law had failed her. Crane bought his way out with blood money and fake papers. Ever since, Mary had been running. Samuel wasn't stolen. He was saved. Garrett listened, anger simmering behind his calm expression. He'd known men like Crane before, bullies with badges, wolves dressed in law. Crane's smirk faltered when he saw the rancher's eyes. "You're making a mistake, Thorne. You stand between me and what's mine, you'll hang with her." Garrett stepped closer. "You come for her again, you'll regret it." Crane spat on the ground. "You got till sunset to think it over. Hand her and the boy over, or I'll come back with men who don't ask twice." He turned his horse and rode off, dust trailing behind him like a curse. Wade disappeared over the hill. The children burst into frightened cries. Mary fell to her knees beside them, holding them close. Garrett crouched beside her, speaking low. "He's bluffing. That badge was fake as his warrant." She shook her head. "He'll be back. He always comes back." "Then we'll be ready," Garrett said. "We'll do this right." He sent Thomas on horseback to town for the real sheriff, his fastest horse, his most trusted task. "Ride hard," he told the boy. "Don't stop till you find Sheriff Wilkes. Tell him it's Silas Crane, and tell him Garrett Thorne sent you." Thomas nodded, fear and determination mixing in his eyes. Emma went next, taking the back trail toward the neighboring ranches to raise help. Garrett turned to Mary. "You pack what you need, but don't run. Running's what he counts on." She looked at him like she wanted to argue, but couldn't find the strength. "Why risk everything for us?" Garrett met her gaze, steady. "Because you're mine to protect now. All of you." The words hit like a promise. For the first time since he'd met her, Mary didn't hide her tears. The children watched, sensing something they couldn't name. A man standing in front of them who wasn't going to run or break or sell them out. "We'll tell the truth," Emma said fiercely. "All of it." Even Samuel nodded, small but brave. "I'll testify. I remember what he did." Then, in a soft voice no one had heard in months, Rose whispered, "We stay here." Garrett looked toward the horizon. Then, that's settled. But just as the last light of day began to fade, the sound of hoofbeats shattered the calm again. This time, more than one set. Garrett's stomach sank. "Too soon," he muttered. "He's early." From the doorway, Mary saw the dust cloud forming. 4 riders this time, not one. He brought men. Garrett grabbed his rifle from the wall and loaded it quick. "Get the children to the root cellar." Mary shook her head. "I'm done running." Garrett's voice hardened. "You'll do as I say." "No," she shot back, eyes blazing. "He took everything once. I won't let him again." The hoofbeats drew closer, echoing off the walls like thunder. Garrett took position by the window, his rifle steady. Outside, Crane's voice carried over the plain, cruel and mocking. "Come out, Mary, or we burn you out." The wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Garrett glanced at her. This woman who'd survived hell and still stood ready to fight. "Then we fight," he said quietly. Mary nodded once, jaw set. The children huddled below in the dark, clutching each other while the night filled with the sound of horses and hate. Crane and his 3 rough men circled the house like coyotes, their horses snorting in the cold night air, rifle barrels glinting whenever the moon slipped from behind the clouds, and Garrett felt a calm settle over him that only came when a man had no choice left but to stand. He moved fast, dragging the heavy table to brace the front door while Mary shoved a cupboard against the back, the wood scraping loud across the floor. Outside, Crane shouted, "Send out the woman and the boy." His voice was smug, certain, like he'd already won. Garrett answered from behind the door, steady and flat. "Over my dead body." A pause, then Crane laughed. "That can be arranged." A gunshot cracked the air, warning fire, meant to scare, and the twins screamed from somewhere below the floorboards where Emma had pushed them into the root cellar with Samuel and baby Grace. Emma, brave as a grown woman, hissed at them to stay quiet, one arm around the baby, the other hand pressed over Rose's mouth when she started to sob. Mary stood at the window with Garrett, her hands trembling but her spine straight. She'd grabbed a kitchen knife at first, useless against guns, until Garrett thrust his old revolver in her palm and showed her how to hold it. "Don't point it unless you mean it," he murmured. Mary's jaw clenched. "I mean it." Outside, one of Crane's men crept toward the barn with a torch, probably thinking if he burned Garrett's livelihood the rancher would panic and surrender. Garrett saw the orange flicker and lifted his rifle. He aimed not to kill, but to warn, firing into the dirt near the man's boots. The man yelped and scrambled back, torch dropping and sputtering out in the dust. Crane cursed, spitting like a snake. "You shoot again, Thorne, and I'll put holes in that house till it falls apart." Garrett didn't answer. He just watched the shadows move, measured the space, listened for the sound of men shifting positions. The prairie outside went quiet in the worst way. No crickets, no wind song, only the tense breath of horses and the scrape of boots. Minutes stretched. In the cellar, baby Grace began to whimper again, the sound small but dangerous. Emma rocked her, whispering, "Hush now, hush," while Thomas pressed his face into Samuel's hair to keep him from shaking. Samuel's eyes were wide in the dark. "He's going to take us," he mouthed. Emma's voice hardened. "Not if we don't let him." Above them, Mary and Garrett stood shoulder to shoulder in the dim room, lit by the fire's dying glow. For hours Mary had held herself like a fortress, but trapped inside with gunmen outside. Her walls finally cracked. "I brought this to your door," she whispered, voice raw. "I thought if I kept moving, if I kept them hidden, I could outrun him. But I can't. Those children deserve better than a mother who's hunted." Garrett turned to her, his face tight with a kind of anger that wasn't aimed at her at all. He reached up and took her face in his hands, rough palms gentle against her cheeks. "Listen to me," he said, slow and sure. "You saved 6 lives. You made promises nobody else would. You kept them even when it cost you everything." Mary's eyes filled, and she shook her head like she couldn't accept the words. Garrett leaned closer. "You're the bravest person I've ever met," he said, "and I'll be damned if I let him take you." Something in Mary broke free then. Fear, guilt, loneliness, and she surged forward, kissing him like she needed air. It wasn't soft or careful. It was desperate, fierce, full of a promise neither of them had spoken yet. For one heartbeat the world went quiet. Then, from the cellar stairs, a small voice whispered, almost awed, "Mama found someone who fights for her." And Mary pulled back, breathing hard, wiping tears with the heel of her hand, the corners of her mouth trembling as she realized the children had seen. Outside, Crane grew impatient. "Last chance," he shouted. "Come out now, or I swear." His threat cut off when the sound of many horses rolled in from the north like distant thunder. Crane's men straightened, thinking it was their reinforcements, and Crane barked, "That's right. Now you're finished, Thorne." But the riders that emerged from the dark were not Crane's. Lantern light bobbed, and a firm voice called out, "Silas Crane, drop your weapon." Sheriff Wilkes rode at the front with 6 deputies behind him, dust-covered but steady, and to their side came neighboring ranchers with shotguns and pitchforks. Men and women who didn't look rich, just fed up with bullies. Thomas rode in near the sheriff, sitting tall in the saddle despite the trembling in his hands. His face streaked with sweat and dirt, but proud as any grown man. Garrett felt something he hadn't felt in years. Relief so sharp it almost hurt. Crane's 3 hired men wavered, glancing at each other, and one by one they lowered their rifles. Crane's smile twisted into a snarl. "This is my lawful arrest," he shouted, waving his fake badge like it was magic. Sheriff Wilkes didn't even slow his horse. "That badge is counterfeit," he said coldly, "and that warrant is trash. I've been looking for you, Crane." Crane's eyes darted, calculating, and in that split second he kicked his horse, trying to bolt through the gap between deputies. Garrett stepped off the porch like he'd been waiting for that move his whole life. As Crane rode past, Garrett reached out and grabbed him by the collar, yanking hard. Crane toppled sideways, hitting the dirt with a grunt as his horse bolted riderless. Garrett stood over him, chest heaving, and for one hot second it looked like he might do something worse. Then he spoke through clenched teeth. "That's for Samuel's mother," he said, and punched Crane once. Hard enough to drop him back into the dust, not hard enough to kill him. Sheriff Wilkes dismounted and snapped cuffs on Crane's wrists while deputies disarmed the other men. "Silas Crane," the sheriff said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "you're under arrest for murder, fraud, and impersonating an officer of the law." Mary stepped onto the porch then, revolver lowered but still in her hand, her face pale and fierce. The sheriff looked up at her, and his expression softened. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, "your testimony is protected now. Those children are legally in your care, and I'll make sure the courts understand that." Mary swayed like her knees might give out, and Garrett caught her elbow. Behind them, the cellar door creaked open. Emma emerged first, eyes scanning for danger, then the twins, then Samuel, then Thomas, who ran straight to Mary, burying his face in her skirt. The pile of hugs came fast, messy, tearful, and for the first time all night the sound in the house wasn't threats or gunfire, but children crying because they were safe. Samuel looked at Crane being dragged toward the sheriff's horse, and, with a sudden spark of boldness, kicked Crane's boot as he passed. Crane cursed. Garrett didn't stop Samuel. He only placed a steady hand on the boy's shoulder, a silent promise that the bad man was leaving and not coming back. By the time the deputies rode off with Crane, the neighbors lingered a moment, offering supplies, hands on shoulders, simple words like, "You're not alone out here," and then they faded into the night, lanterns bobbing away across the prairie. Later, when the ranch finally went quiet again and the children slept in a tangled heap like always, Mary and Garrett sat on the porch under a sky full of stars, both too tired to speak for a while. Mary's hand rested near Garrett's, not quite touching. The air smelled of dust and smoke and something new, possibility. Finally, Garrett reached for her fingers and held them, his grip gentle but sure. "You don't have to leave now," he said. Mary stared out into the dark, breathing slow. "I know," she whispered. A long pause settled between them, soft instead of heavy. Then she turned her head and asked the question that held all the fear and hope of the last 2 years. "So what happens now?" Dawn arrived like a blessing, soft gold spilling across the yard and turning the frost on the grass into tiny sparks. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the ranch woke without fear. Inside the house, the children stirred slowly, not with the startled panic of being chased, but with the lazy confusion of safety. Lily blinking at the ceiling as if she didn't trust it, Rose curled against her twin like she'd done for years, Samuel clutching Emma's sleeve in his sleep, baby Grace snoring softly against Emma's shoulder, and Thomas waking with his first breath already asking the same question his eyes were asking. "Is it still okay?" Mary moved through them like a quiet wind, smoothing hair, pulling blankets up, touching each forehead as if counting them into existence. When she stepped into the kitchen, Garrett was already there, awkward at the stove, trying to make breakfast like a man who could mend fences but still feared frying pans. He had eggs in a skillet, biscuits warming, coffee strong enough to wake the dead. And when Mary reached for a plate, their hands brushed and neither pulled away. They ate together, all 8 of them, crowded around a table that had been lonely for years. The food was simple, but the moment was rich. Thomas chewed fast, eyes bright, and then, as if the words had been burning in him all night, he blurted, "Can we stay forever?" The room went still. Emma's gaze flicked to Mary, careful and protective. Lily held her breath. Even Samuel looked up, watching Mary's face like it might decide everything. Mary's throat tightened. She looked at Garrett, and Garrett looked back. No pressure in his eyes, no demand, only the steady openness of a man who was offering instead of taking. After breakfast, Mary escaped into the garden, needing air, needing space to feel the weight of what had changed. She knelt in the dirt and began pulling weeds with more force than necessary. Hands rough, nails already stained, as if work could keep her from shaking. Behind her, she heard boots in the path, slow and hesitant. Garrett stopped a few steps away, hat in hand, the morning light catching the lines on his face. He wasn't smooth about anything, and Mary had learned that was part of his honesty. "I've been thinking," he said. Mary didn't turn. "That can be dangerous." He huffed a small laugh, then grew serious again. "I loved once," he said. "Lost everything. Thought I was done living for more than chores and cattle." Mary finally looked at him, eyes wary but soft. "Then 6 children appeared behind me," she said, a faint smile tugging at her mouth despite herself. Garrett's gaze drifted toward the house where faint giggles floated through an open window. 7 reasons to live again, he corrected gently. He stepped closer and held out his hands. Mary stared at them, calloused, scarred, honest hands, and after a heartbeat, she placed her own in his, her palms just as rough, just as tired, meeting his like equals. Garrett swallowed, Adam's apple bobbing. "I'm not good with words," he admitted. "Never was. But I know what I want." Mary's breath caught, because she could feel the moment tipping into something that would change everything. Garrett's eyes didn't waver. "Marry me," he said simply. "Be my family. Let me be theirs." The garden went quiet except for the distant creak of the windmill. Mary's first instinct was to flinch, not from him, but from the size of the offer. A husband, a home, a future that didn't involve running. Her mind flashed with old bruises, old fear, the taste of shame. Then she looked past Garrett to the window where she could see Emma lifting baby Grace to bounce her on her hip like she'd been born for it. Thomas showing Samuel something in his hands with careful patience. Lily and Rose whispering and smiling over a piece of ribbon. They were loud and hungry and complicated, and they were hers. She looked back at Garrett and whispered the truth that had been sitting like a stone in her chest. "You'd really take on 6 children?" Garrett shook his head slowly, his grip tightening just enough to make her feel how certain he was. "I'm not taking them on," he said. "I'm asking them to take me on." That did it. Tears rose fast, hot and honest, and Mary didn't bother to hide them. "They're loud," she choked out, laughing through the tears now. "Expensive. Messy. They break things, and they argue, and they're perfect," Garrett said, and his voice cracked on the last word like he meant it with his whole life. Mary stared at him for a long second, letting herself feel the safety in his steadiness, letting herself believe she wasn't a burden. Then she nodded once, small but final. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Garrett. I'll marry you." He exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for years. And when he kissed her this time, it was different from the night before. Gentle, careful, full of tomorrow instead of survival. A soft gasp came from behind the shed, and suddenly the bushes rustled. Of course they'd been listening. Emma popped out first, arms crossed, tried to look stern but failing. "Does this mean we stay?" she demanded, though her eyes were shining. Garrett turned toward her, smiling wide and unguarded. "Forever," he said. Thomas barreled out next. "You'll really be our pa?" he asked, voice trembling with hope he didn't know how to control. Garrett lowered himself to one knee, so he was level with them, not towering, not claiming, inviting. "If you'll have me," he said. Samuel lingered behind, half-hidden, eyes watchful. Garrett held out his hand to him too, patient. Samuel stared, then stepped forward and placed his small hand in Garrett's. His mouth twitched into the smallest smile. "I'll have you," he whispered. Rose, who had barely spoken since the day she'd lost her parents, looked up at Mary and then at Garrett, and in a clear, full sentence that made everyone freeze, she said, "This is home now." Mary's hand flew to her mouth, tears spilling again, while Lily squealed and hugged her sister like she'd just performed a miracle. And then baby Grace toddled into the garden on unsteady legs, arms raised for balance, eyes locked on Garrett. She reached for him with a soft, urgent sound. "Papa." The world stopped. Emma's breath caught. Thomas's eyes went wide. Mary's heart slammed in her chest. Garrett stared as if he'd been struck by lightning. Then he lifted Grace into his arms with shaking hands, his eyes filling as he pressed his forehead to hers. "Yes, sweetheart," he whispered, voice breaking. "Papa." 6 months later, winter settled gentle over the ranch, laying down snow like a clean sheet over old pain. They held a small wedding right there at the house. No fancy church, just neighbors bundled in coats, lanterns glowing warm. The whole community gathered like they decided this family mattered. Mary wore a simple dress and wildflowers in her hair, cheeks pink from cold and joy. Garrett stood beside her in his best shirt, looking like he still couldn't believe he deserved any of it. The children were part of everything. Emma holding the baby, Thomas carrying rings tied to a ribbon, Lily and Rose scattering tiny pine sprigs in the snow as if they were petals. They made vows with their hands linked, not just to each other, but to the 6 small fingers clasping theirs. And when the first soft flakes began to fall, it felt like the sky itself was blessing them. That night, the 8 of them gathered around the fireplace, boots lined by the door, cheeks warm, bellies full, laughter easy. Garrett sat in his chair with baby Grace asleep on his chest, her tiny hand fisted in his shirt like she claimed him for good. Mary sat close beside him, her head resting against his shoulder, watching the children scattered on the floor, Thomas reading in a serious voice, the twins giggling over a game, Samuel leaning quietly into the group instead of hiding away. Thomas looked up and said, "Tell us the story again." Mary smiled. "Which story?" Samuel's eyes lifted, bright in the firelight. "How we became a family," he said. Garrett and Mary exchanged a look that held every mile of dust, every night of fear, every moment that had led them here. Garrett cleared his throat, voice soft and steady. "Well," he began, "it started with a question." Mary's smile widened as she finished for him. "And 6 children who refused to stay hidden. Outside, snow fell in silence. Inside, the fire crackled, the house glowed, and the emptiness that had once lived in every corner was gone, replaced by something strong enough to last.